Boldwood presents The Cornish Midwife, written by Jo Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Ella's attempts at breathing in and out slowly were being seriously curtailed by the hold-it-all-in underwear she was wearing. She had no idea how she was going to manage a glass of champagne at the reception, let alone eat anything. All she'd had the day before was a bowl of soup, so maybe a glass of champagne would be a bad idea anyway. It would all be worth it in the end, though, and Weller would get the wedding he'd always dreamed of. So what if it was usually the bride who was supposed to plan every last detail, and it wasn't the wedding she'd have chosen? Their relationship had been different from the start, and she'd been glad not to have to do all the organising. OK, maybe the 60s wedding dress he'd bought from a vintage shop in Camden, without her even seeing it, let alone trying it on, might have been a bit on the snug side, but it was a small price to pay. "You decent as Ella?" her dad called out from the other side of the door. "I hope so. If I'm not now, then I never will be." Turning, she smiled as he pushed the door open and mirrored her expression. "Will I do you think?" "Oh, my love, you look amazing. I hope Weller realises what a lucky man he is." Her father held out his arms. "I can't believe I'm losing my little girl." "You're not losing me, Dad." Ella leant her head against his chest, not even caring if her shoulder-length veil got knocked skew-if in the process. In a weird sort of way, she was doing this for her dad, for both her parents. They'd made it clear they couldn't wait to be grandparents, a wish only Ella could grant, and getting married first was the right thing to do, in their eyes anyway. None of that changed the fact that Weller probably wasn't their first choice of son-in-law, though. "You'll be hundreds of miles away, though, won't you?" "I've been hundreds of miles away since uni, Dad. But as long as you and Mum are there, Port Agnes will always be home." Ella sniffed, determined not to cry and ruin the eyeliner that had taken her weeks of trial and effort to perfect. She might have been able to keep a steady hand in a life-or-death situation at work, but when it came to creating the perfect 60s flick with a liquid eyeliner brush, she might as well have been wearing boxing gloves. "I know you're doing the right thing, making a career for yourself that you wouldn't be able to do back in Port Agnes. But I still can't help hoping you'll come back one day, when you've got every promotion possible under your belt." "Maybe one day." They both knew she was lying, and Ella fought to hold in a sigh. Maybe if she hadn't been an only child, it wouldn't have been so difficult. There might have been at least one brother or sister among the babies her parents had tried so hard to conceive through years of IVF before Ella was born, who wanted to take over the family bakery and never feel they had to leave Port Agnes to make their parents proud. Relationships were all about compromise, though, and Weller's life was in London. If she wanted to be with him, then Port Agnes was never really going to be home again. London was better for both of their careers, which was why she'd been so willing to make it their permanent home. It was the only way she could envisage earning enough to help her parents out when they retired, if they needed it. She was a senior midwife in a busy city centre hospital, and Weller's career as an indie record producer was just starting to take off. They were achieving things they never could if they'd settled down in Cornwall, and whatever her father might say, deep down she knew he was proud. The last time she'd been home for a weekend, he'd told everyone who'd come into the bakery about Ella's latest promotion, and her degree certificate was still on display behind the counter. "Just as long as he promises to look after you." Her dad took a step back and nodded slowly. "He might not be my cup of tea, but if he makes you happy, that's all that matters." "He will. My biggest worry right now is that the registrar will make a pig's ear of pronouncing my name. Sometimes I wonder if I should have shortened it to Ella on an official basis." She smiled at the look that crossed her father's face. Jago Mehenick was a dyed-in-the-wool Cornishman, who at one point had even considered campaigning for local office with a manifesto of pursuing Cornish independence. So his only daughter's decision to move to London for university must have been baffling at first. "Isella is a beautiful name, and any registrar worth their salt would make the effort to learn how to pronounce it. Ella's a tenner penny in comparison, and if you're going to insist on shortening it, then Izzy would be a far better option. Her father folded his arms, daring her to argue, and she couldn't help but smile again. Ella works for me. At least it did until I got engaged. Having a name that rhymes with my husband's is a bit, I don't know, Ella and Wella just doesn't sound right. Jago shook his head. What kind of a name is Wella anyway? We must have had this conversation 100 times. You know Jim and Karen named him after Paul Weller, and you know why. They met at one of the Jam's concerts. She raised an eyebrow, but her father just shrugged. I don't get it, the whole mods thing. Fancy turning up to your wedding on a Lambretta. You don't have to get it, Dad. It's something their family are into, not to mention the fact it's the reason Weller's got a career in music. If theming a wedding around that makes him happy, then I can live with it, even if it does sometimes feel like a bit of an obsession. Ella shrugged. Anyway, getting to the wedding on a Lambretta is a good decision, given where we're having it. At least you'll be able to weave through the traffic. But that's another thing, isn't it? Jago was like a dog with a bone when he got onto his favourite subject, which was anything that extolled the virtues of Cornwall over everywhere else on the planet. You could have been getting married in St. Jude's Church. I told you it was in Cornwall life as one of the 10 prettiest churches in the county, didn't I? And that's saying something in a county as beautiful as ours. Dad, go on. Tell me you didn't grow up dreaming of getting married there. Like me and your mother and your nana and grandpa before you. OK, I might have imagined it once or twice when I was still young enough to fantasise about wearing a princess dress on the big day. But Weller has always wanted to get married at the old Marylebone Town Hall. His parents copied Paul McCartney, then his mum and dad got married there in the late 90s. Weller was already a teenager at the time, and he remembers it really clearly. It was the first thing we talked about after he proposed. It might not be your idea of tradition, but it means just as much to them as St. Jude's does to us. I suppose you're right. His response was grudging all the same. But I would never forgive myself if I didn't ask this, and I know your grandpa asked your mother when she married me. What is it, Dad? I just want to make sure that you really want to do this, and you're not just going through with it because you think it's all too late. I need to know that he's really the man you want to marry, without even a hint of doubt. Because it's not just one day, this marriage lot, you know, and sometimes it's hard. You and Mum have always made it look so easy. That's because your mother's a saint, Jago laughed. But your grandpa wanted to make sure she wasn't just settling for me because they didn't let her take that job singing on the cruise ships when she left school. I think sometimes they regretted it as much as she did, keeping her tied to Port Agnes and bound to marry a local lad from the very small pool available, just because that was all the choice she had. You don't really think that's the only reason she chose you, do you? Ella had heard about her mother's dreams of singing for a living when she was younger, and she'd known Ruth had never been given the choice to pursue those dreams. But it had never crossed her mind that her father had been the consolation prize. I like to think not, Jago grinned. But we're not talking about your mum and me. I think we've been married long enough now to prove our doubters wrong. Just tell me you're sure he's the right one for you, because you can't change people. I'm sure, Dad. I love... Wella caught herself just before she'd been about to utter the name that definitely didn't belong to her fiancé, and shook her head hard. Wella. I love Wella, I really do. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself. Her father gave her an appraising stare. If he'd realised she'd been about to say someone else's name instead of Wella's, it was all his fault anyway. She'd only done it because her father had mentioned her dream of getting married at St. Jude's, when she'd been young enough to feel like a church wedding and a big princess dress mattered. Back then, when she pictured walking down the aisle, the one person she imagined waiting at the other end was the boy she'd dated all through sixth form, Dan Ferguson. That was the thing about first loves, though. They were all fantasy, unrealistic expectations and oversized love hearts with initials and arrows running through them, doodled on the back of exercise books. She'd been hauled up in front of the headmistress for that one, and Ella could still picture the look on the teacher's face as she delivered a stark warning. You'll have to cut out that sort of thing, Miss Mehenick. if you want to be a good enough role model to be worthy of being head girl." So Ella had cut it out, at least the part about doodling on the back of her exercise books. No one could police her thoughts, though, and the fantasies about marrying Dan had been hers alone. They hadn't diminished in the 2 years they'd dated, and she'd even held on to them when she'd first headed off to university in London. But she hadn't thought about any of that in years. Not until her dad started talking about how much better it would have been to get married at St. Jude's. It was all down to that, and maybe the fact she'd barely eaten for the last 48 hours. It didn't mean anything. "Well, my love, that's all I needed to hear. And even if you change your mind on the way over there, I want you to know that it wouldn't be too late." Something about the way he said it gave Ella goosebumps. Was it really not too late? If she changed her mind, could she still walk away from all this? Straining against the dress in another attempt to take a deep breath, she shook the feeling off. Last-minute jitters. That was all this was. The best thing she could do was just get on with it, the way she always did. "We'd better get across the road, then. I don't think the bride's usual prerogative of being late is an option. There's a ceremony booked in straight after ours." "Like a conveyor belt, then." Her dad couldn't stop the veiled comparison with St. Jude's, and she forced another smile. "It doesn't matter, as long as you're the one walking me down that aisle and Wella is the one waiting for me at the end of it. It could be anywhere." "OK, then, my little Isella. Let's show London what we're made of." Jago crooked his arm, and she linked hers through it. It was a short walk from the Dorset Square Hotel to the old Marylebone Town Hall. The hotel might have been budget-busting, but it was the perfect venue for the wedding breakfast. And with such a small guest list, choosing the Soho room for the ceremony, which had a maximum capacity of 20 guests, seemed a perfect fit too. Wella had wanted to keep it low-key, and it was sensible to save as much as they could for the 3-bedroomed flat they were moving to, in preparation for starting a family. It would allow Wella to have a studio at home too. Getting on the property ladder in central London had been a hard-won dream, and hopefully it would give her parents another reason to feel proud of her. Not to mention giving Wella a few much-needed brownie points. "At least it isn't windy." Ella dipped her head as they walked the last 100 metres or so to the steps of the old town hall. She hated being the centre of attention, and she'd seen a few passers-by look in her direction. So keeping her gaze firmly fixed on the pavement to avoid eye contact seemed like the best option. "Your mother standing on the steps?" Jago said, with the words an upward inflection at the end, as if he was asking a question, and Ella finally raised her gaze from the pavement. She should be inside by now. "I know." Her father quickened his pace, and Ella had to half-run to keep up. "She's got that look she only ever gets when something's worrying the hell out of her." "What's wrong?" Ella beat her father to the question as they met her mother on the steps. "I've had a call from Wella. The Lambretta has broken down." Ruth Mehenick furrowed her brow as she looked from her husband to her daughter and back again. "But it's okay. They're on their way in a taxi, so they should be here soon." "Should?" Jago bellowed the word, making a city-confident pigeon fly up from the step beside him. "If he ruins this wedding with his silly themed antics, I swear to God—" "Dad, it's fine. I'm sure they'll make it in time." Despite her words, Ella's stomach dropped. The registrar had been quite clear that lateness wasn't an option. If Wella didn't get here in the next 10 minutes, they'd almost certainly lose their slot, and her parents would have to go back to Port Agnes and tell everyone that there had been no wedding after all. It would be so embarrassing. "Let's all go and have a chat with some of the guests. It'll pass the time, and it might help take your mind off the stress of waiting." Ruth already had hold of her husband's arm, but Ella shook her head. "You and Dad go in. I'll wait out here so I can see when Wella turns up." "It's bad luck for the bride to see the groom before the ceremony." Her mother gave her a pleading look, but she shook her head again. "I'll be more stressed if I'm inside." "We'll stay out here with you, then." Her father still looked as if he might land a blow on Wella's nose the moment he turned up, and she didn't want her wedding day to kick off with an argument. That would definitely make her the centre of unwanted attention. "I'd rather wait by myself. Anyway, I need you two to see if you can charm the registrar into giving us as long as possible." "We'll speak to her, but then we're coming straight back out." Her dad's tone was insistent. "I'm not leaving my daughter standing out here like the last oggie in the bakery that no one wants to take home." "Thanks, Dad." Ella laughed despite herself. It was partial to a baking analogy if he could think of one, having run the family bakery business since he left school. The comparison might not be exactly flattering, but she found it strangely comforting. And if anyone could persuade the registrar to give them a bit more time, it was Jo Mehenick. Watching her parents walk up the steps hand in hand, Ella breathed out. At least negotiating with the registrar would keep them busy and stop them worrying about her so much. She hated it when they did that. If she'd been uncomfortable about sticking out like a sore thumb in her wedding dress, standing alone on the steps outside the old town hall wearing one was a whole other level of attention she could do without. "Come on, Weller." Whispering the words under her breath, she attempted to blend in with a pillar at the top of the stairs, all the time scanning the road in front of the building, willing a black cab to pull up and for Weller and his best man, Steve, to get out. Her father had had even more to say about Steve's name than he did about Weller's the first time he heard it. "Can that boy even be bothered to finish the name Steve?" was about the gist of it. Ella liked Steve, though, which was just as well, seeing that he came as a package with Weller. They'd been best mates since sixth form college, and he shared Weller's passion for all things mod. Steve was the sound technician at Weller's start-up record label, and the fact that they got on so well, when they spent as much time together as they did, said a lot about their friendship. Their shared love of the same music let Ella off the hook, and she didn't have to pretend to enjoy camping at the Stone Valley music festivals or use her annual leave up to go and keep Weller company. They were the times when she got the chance to head back to Port Agnes and give her parents her undivided attention. After all, she'd had theirs all her life. Looking towards the road again, a crowd of what appeared to be mostly teenage girls had congregated at the bottom of the steps, and they seemed to be on an even higher level of alert than Ella. Every time a black cab looked like it might be about to stop, they surged forward with their mobile phones held aloft to capture the perfect shot of whoever it was they were expecting. In the end, curiosity and a desperate desire to distract herself from how late it was getting got the better of Ella. "Excuse me?" Approaching a young girl on the edge of the crowd, she cleared her throat to be heard over the excited chatter. "But can I ask who it is you're waiting for?" "Jed Harris and Petra Alexia?" The girl looked her up and down, but she clearly wasn't curious enough about Ella to ask why she was hanging around on the steps of the old town hall in a wedding dress. "Thank you." She might be turning 30 on her next birthday, but even she knew who Jed Harris and Petra Alexia were. He was a YouTube sensation who'd made a substantial fortune from a string of appearances on reality shows. And Petra was a former Love Island contestant and something the press called an influencer, which apparently meant she was paid to advertise products on Instagram. At least no one would be looking at Ella anymore. "Is Ella?" She looked up as her mother called her name, trying to read her expression. "Have you heard from Weller?" she called out as she headed back up the steps towards her mum. "No, he's not answering his phone now, so he must be somewhere without a signal." Even Ruth didn't look convinced. "But the registrar says if he's not here in the next few minutes, then you'll have to rebook for another time. Apparently there's a wedding straight after yours, and the rumour is it's someone famous." "That's who they're all waiting for." Ella gestured towards the ever-growing crowd at the foot of the steps. "But I don't think it's anyone you'll have heard of." "I don't care if it's Prince Charles and Camilla renewing their vows. I just want Weller to get his behind in gear and get here in time. Your father's about to burst a blood vessel as it is. I've banned him from coming out so he doesn't make a scene. You know what he's like when he gets a bee in his bonnet about something. At least there aren't 150 people filling the pews at St. Jude's waiting for a wedding that might not happen." Ella bit her lip. If the worst came to the worst and they had to postpone the wedding, it might be embarrassing, but at least they'd only be inconveniencing a handful of people. She hadn't been able to invite even her closest friends from the hospital or her childhood friends from Port Agnes. But now that seemed like a good thing. Having old friends travel for a non-wedding would have been a disaster. "You don't think he's having second thoughts, do you, Mum?" "No, of course not." The crease between Ruth's eyebrows could have clamped a 50-pence piece in place. "Why, are you?" No, just a few pre-wedding jitters, that's all. Ella shrugged, feeling anything but casual. And all this waiting around really isn't helping. Oh, there's a cab now. Ruth was halfway down the stairs before Ella could stop her, but the roar from the crowd nearly knocked them both backwards. It definitely wasn't Weller. That's the celebrity wedding booked in after us. If they're here already... Ella didn't even have the chance to finish the sentence before someone tapped her on the shoulder. Miss Mehenick, I'm really sorry, but unless your fiancé shows up in the next 5 minutes, we'll have to move on to the wedding after yours. We're pushing it as it is, and we really can't keep the next couple waiting. The registrar, who was wearing a dark-fitted skirt suit and an air of impatience, looked at her watch. We've really been as generous as we can. What if the next couple were prepared to wait a bit longer? Ruth turned to the registrar, who shook her head. It doesn't work like that, and we really couldn't ask someone to push their own wedding back, just because you've had a bit of a hitch. Well, you might not be able to ask, but I can. Ruth was down the steps and pushing her way through the crowd of celeb spotters before the registrar could even respond. She wouldn't actually have the gall to ask them to delay their wedding, would she? The registrar looked at Ella. I wouldn't put it past her. It would only make things worse if Ella tried to stop her mother. Jed and Petra would tell her there was no way they were postponing their wedding, and that would be that. But at least Ruth would feel like she'd done her bit. Except that wasn't it. And seconds later, Ruth was heading back up the stairs, with Jed and Petra trailing in her wake, the crowd still ebbing and flowing behind them. It's Ella, right? Jed pronounced her name perfectly and stuck out his hand. He had brilliantly white teeth and a smile that showed off his expensive dental work. Your mum tells us you've had a bit of a disaster this morning with a missing groom. Aye, yes, but he's not missing. He's just broken down en route. Ella was only too aware of the crowd hanging on their every word. Nightmare. Petra had the long legs and wide-eyed look of a startled foal. Either way, it's delayed the wedding, right? Jed waited until she nodded. Your mum asked if we mind holding on for a bit before I finally make an honest woman of this gorgeous girl. I'm sure we can keep ourselves busy with our friends here for a bit longer, can't we, babe? A bit of live streaming on Insta never goes amiss. He looked at Petra, who nodded in agreement, and the crowd let out another roar of approval. I love you, Jed! One young girl at the front of the crowd, with train track braces and dot-to-dot spots, looked like she might be about to pass out. The old Marylebone Town Hall might have had to cope with Beatlemania back in the 60s, but these days a YouTuber could have much the same impact on a young fan. If he'd been there, Weller would have been horrified. I'm assuming that's okay with you? Jed peered at the registrar's name badge. Fiona? Of course, as long as the two of you are happy. She smiled, suddenly only too willing to oblige, and Jed handed his phone to a man standing to the right of him. Get all of this, will you, Jimmy? Like I said, this will make a great Insta story while we're waiting for the main event. Let's get a couple of shots first before we start live streaming. Jed put one arm around Petra and the other around the registrar. Whether they liked it or not, Ella and Ruth were marshalled into the photo too. It was a small price to pay for the celebrity couple delaying their wedding. The next 10 minutes passed with Jed and Petra taking a series of shots and posing with fans, while the registrar continued to drum her fingers on the notebook she was holding. Glancing back at the road, Ella made a pact with herself. If Weller didn't step out of one of the next 10 cars that passed, then she was calling the wedding off, even if Jed and Petra were still willing to wait. As stressed as all this was making Ella, it would be even worse for her parents, and there was her dad's blood pressure to think about. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all drove past, and then a black cab came into view. Her heart had already lurched at least 30 times at the sight of a black cab, so she wasn't expecting it to stop. Even when it did, she was almost beyond believing that Weller would be the person to step out. And then he did. He'd made it, in the nick of time. We were just about to give up on you. Ella didn't know whether to hug him or slap him when he bounded up the steps with Steve following hot on his heels. I know, I'm sorry we broke down and then... He couldn't meet her gaze, and he turned to Steve instead, who slowly nodded his head. And then what? Ella was all too aware of the crowd watching them, and she could almost feel Jed's breath on the back of her neck. So much for not wanting to be the centre of attention. You've got to tell her, mate. It was Steve's voice, urging Weller to spit it out, but he was still looking at the floor. Go on, we talked about this. I'm sorry, Ella. When the Lambretta broke down, my first thought was to hail a cab and get here as quickly as I could. I wanted to marry you so we could move into the flat and start a family, just like we talked about. I really did. At least I thought so. You thought so? Ella repeated the words, wondering if she was going to wake up in a minute and find herself still lying in bed at the Dorset Square Hotel. But she couldn't be imagining how tight her dress felt as she struggled to steady her breathing while the crowd watched on. If Weller had noticed them, he didn't seem to care, and he carried on regardless. We got a cab straight away, but the closer it got to you, the more I got the urge to ask the cabbie to just keep going. So we did. We've been past here 6 times already. Did you see me standing here waiting? Her voice sounded quiet, even to her own ears, and she was barely able to believe she was asking the question. I did, and I'm sorry. But it felt like a sign, the Lambretta breaking down. The last chance to stop things before we both did something we'd end up regretting. He tried to reach out and touch her, but she pulled away as if she'd been burnt. We're just too different, you and me. We don't want the same things. I don't think we ever have. But I knew it for certain when I was in the back of the cab. I had that song by The Jam playing on a loop in my head. What the hell are you talking about? What song? This couldn't be real. The noise of the busy London street seemed to have faded away, and the crowd didn't even murmur, all of them waiting to hear what Weller said next. You know that song I'm always playing? I've changed my address. When poor Weller sings about not seeing the point of marriage and being tied down to a mortgage and kids. It was like he was talking about me, and I realised I was doing all this, settling down and getting married, because I'm 35 and that's what the world expects, not because I want to. And it took seeing me standing on the steps outside our wedding venue for you to realise that. Ella shoved the bouquet she was holding against his chest, and he tried to grab her hand again, but she was too quick for him. He didn't get to patronise her with words of comfort. He'd already done enough by humiliating her and her parents in front of a crowd of strangers. For your information, I had my doubts too, but I would never, ever have treated you the way you've treated me. You don't do that to someone you love. No, you don't. Weller shook his head. I don't love you, Ella. I'm so sorry. I think if I could ever have loved someone enough to make them my wife, it would have been you. But I can't keep lying to either of us. You absolute... Ruth launched herself at him, and it took Jed and his videographer, Jimmy, to hold her back, her arms and legs flailing in all directions. This lot might be able to stop me now, but when Jacob finds out about this, you'll wish you'd never been born. He's not worth it, Mum. Ripping off her engagement ring, Ella threw it into the crowd, scattering them apart as they fought to retrieve it. She was beyond caring whose social media page she or her ring turned up on. I'm sorry, Ella, please. She turned away from Weller as he called out. Easing his guilt was his problem, not hers. Ignoring the commotion still going on behind her, she headed back up the steps to break the news to her father, and she felt an arm go around her shoulders. It was Petra, of all people, and she had a look of genuine sympathy on her face. You'll be glad he did this one day, I promise you. You think? Tears choked at the back of Ella's throat, but she couldn't seem to cry. I'm certain of it. She's right, you know. You can do better. Her mum was suddenly at her other side, her rage seeming to subside and her voice taking on a far gentler tone. It's going to be hard telling everyone, but like you said, at least there aren't loads of guests here, and this will all soon be yesterday's news. Except what goes on the internet is out there forever. Jed shrugged as he came towards them. And there was a fair portion of the crowd taking photos, some of them even filming it. This day just keeps getting better. The first tears plopped onto Ella's cheek, and once they'd started, she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to stop them. She'd always thought her wedding day would change her life, but she was pretty sure no one could have predicted it would turn out quite like this. Chapter 2. Ella breathed in for the count of 3, held her breath for 4 seconds, and then released it to a silent count of 5. As a midwife, she'd been ahead of the curve about the so-called power of breathing. It had always been essential to life, but now the self-help gurus were keen to say they'd created something new. The 3-4-5 breathing technique was supposed to be the equivalent of a double gin and tonic, and since she couldn't turn up to her first day at the Port Agnes midwifery unit the worse for wear, she just had to hope that it was going to work. It might only be a 6-month contract to cover the secondment of another midwife, but that was all she needed. 6 months would be more than enough to get her life back on track and forget that Weller had ever been a part of it. Parking her Fiat 500 in the last available space in the staff car park, she repeated the breathing exercise a few more times. She could do this, as long as no one mentioned her 15 minutes of fame. Her hair was a different colour, back to its original dark brown, and much wavier than it had been when she'd been videoed on the steps of the old Marylebone Town Hall. It was a classic get that man out of your hair move, but the hairdresser had been a bit overly enthusiastic, cutting in shorter and shorter layers to make the most of her hair's natural curl. So the last month had been one long bad hair day. It had taken some moulding clay and half a can of hairspray to get it all to lay flat for the job interview. But 6 weeks later, on day 1 of her new job, she finally had the soft curls she'd been going for, instead of looking like Brian May in his 70s heyday. Getting out of the car, she headed across the car park and through the entrance to the midwifery unit. It was a sunny day, but it would probably have been just as bright inside the building, even if the skies outside had been grey. The walls were painted sky blue, except for the one that wrapped around the waiting area in reception, which was a brightly coloured mural of families playing on the beach in Port Agnes. When she'd come for her interview, the head of the unit, Anna Jones, had told her the mural had been created by a local artist who donated his time for free as a thank you to the team for helping a family member through a difficult delivery. Whatever the reasons behind the mural, it was hard to look at it and not feel happy. "Good morning." Ella stopped at the reception desk and smiled when the young woman behind the counter looked up at her. "I'm Ella Mehenick, the new midwife, covering Sadie Turner's secondment." "Oh, yes, Anna told me you were starting today." The receptionist stood up and took a package out of the drawer. "I've pulled together all the things you need to get started. Here's your ID badge and a fob for the door, as well as a permit for the car park, which you'll need to put in the window any time you're here for more than 2 hours. I think Anna's going to have you shadow her today, so you can pop it in your car when you go out later. She'll give you all of the kit you need for when you go out and do your rounds too. I'm Penny, by the way." "Pleased to meet you, Penny." "You too. I've only recently moved to Port Agnes, so I'm just getting to know people. But Anna said you grew up here." "That's right, but I haven't lived here in over 10 years, so I hardly know anyone anymore either. All my old friends left for uni and never came back. I think it's because the choice of jobs on offer are brilliant, as long as you want to be in the hospitality industry or buy yourself a fishing boat. That started to change since they built the unit, though, and it was part of the draw of deciding to come home for a few months." She wasn't about to offer the other reasons up if she didn't have to. It was just good to get through an introduction back in Port Agnes without being outed as the jilted bride who'd become the sort of viral internet sensation no one wanted to be. Even 2 months on, she was still getting emails asking if she was willing to be interviewed on some daytime TV show or other about what it felt like to be jilted. She could probably have summed it up in one word, but it wasn't the sort of thing you could say on daytime TV, or to her new colleagues, even if they were only going to be temporary. According to her parents, the local press in Port Agnes had run stories on her for the best part of a month, after fans of Jed Harris and Petra Alexia had posted the video of Weller telling her, in no uncertain terms, that she was dumped. The online video had circulated worldwide, and someone had even made a meme featuring Ella in her wedding dress with text saying, "This is what a bad day really looks like." She doubted if anyone was hounding Weller. He seemed to have gone to ground, and even Stee claimed not to know where he was. Not that she wanted to speak to him. She just wanted to know where to dump his stuff. In the end, after giving him a whole 48 hours to respond to her messages, the local Oxfam shop had been gifted everything he'd left behind in their rented flat. It was a compromise, seeing as her father had wanted to burn it all and then post the contents of the dog poo bin at the end of their road onto his forwarding address. Luckily for him, Jago Mehenick didn't know where Weller was. Thank God they'd never actually got as far as putting down the deposit on the place they'd been planning to buy. That would have made things even messier. Some people might say Weller had ended things just in time, but none of them was standing jilted on the steps of their wedding venue. "I'll just give Anna a call and see if she's free to come and collect you." Penny smiled, bringing Ella back to the present. "Thanks, that's great." Ella's eyes were drawn to the mural again while she waited. One end started with a scene on a hillside, and then the rolling fields led to a row of houses. At the far end of the mural was the artist's interpretation of the harbour. It was a jolly scene, filled with children running after kites and dogs chasing across the grass towards the beach. The row of houses that flanked one side of the harbour was painted in the same bright colours as its real-life equivalent. There was Mercer's Row, the terrace of old fishermen's cottages that had been owned by a holiday rental company for as long as Ella could remember, and where she'd had her first official part-time job as a cleaner when she'd still been in sixth form. Her cheeks went hot as another memory of Mercer's Row came to mind, and she tried to shake it off. But there were just some things she couldn't forget, no matter how much she might want to. The house with the bright red door and the big bay window in the middle of the harbour scene was Mehenick's bakery, where her parents had lived and worked for their whole married life, and where she'd called home until she left for university. Peering at the mural, she half expected to see an image of herself staring out from the upstairs window across the harbour, like she'd done so often growing up. Back then, she'd longed for the adventure of London and leaving behind the confines of the pretty Cornish fishing village. She didn't want to spend her life telling anyone who'd listen that she was Port Agnes born and bred, like her parents and grandparents. She'd so desperately wanted to make them proud of her for doing something different. Her mother had been denied that opportunity and had given up her dreams of singing to run the bakery. But Ella had been given every chance, and she'd had no intention of wasting them. Yet here she was, back living in her old bedroom above Mehenick's bakery, and not sure if she'd made the best decision of her life, or taken a backward step she'd never recover from, in committing to come home for the next few months. "Oh, Ella, brilliant, you're here." Anna emerged from behind the door to the birthing suite and hugged her, rather than offering the expected handshake. "Sorry if that's a bit full on, but I couldn't let myself believe you were actually going to show up until I saw you here in the flesh. I still keep pinching myself that we're getting someone with your experience for a post at this level, and for a temporary contract at that. I just hope I don't disappoint." "Of course you won't. Come in and I'll introduce you to the rest of the team. I thought Jess could take you out on her rounds this morning, and you could shadow me this afternoon. Then tomorrow you can hit the ground running. We'll pretty much muck in here with everything, though. So just because I'm head of the unit, it doesn't mean I don't still get stuck in. In a rural midwifery unit with our patients spread across such a wide geographical area, there's never a dull moment." "I'm counting on it." Ella smiled, and a frisson of nerves twisted in her stomach. She'd been a hospital midwife for so long and had specialised in high-risk pregnancies and deliveries over the last few years. It was going to be really different working at a midwifery unit where they automatically transferred any kind of high-risk mum-to-be to the nearest hospital maternity unit in Truro. "Well, you picked a good morning to meet the team." Anna held the door open for her and they headed down the corridor. "We've only got one lady in labour this morning and none of our clinics start for another half an hour, so most of the team who are on duty are in the staff room." "Great, it'll be good to meet everyone." Ella just hoped none of them were devotees of YouTube and Instagram. It had been less than 2 months since the wedding that never was, but she'd already come to hate hearing those dreaded words. "I'm sure I recognise you from somewhere." "Everybody, this is Ella Mehenick, the latest addition to our team." Anna, who was tall and slim, with long red hair which was doing its best to escape from a plait, stepped to one side. "Nice to meet you, Ella. I'm Frankie, one of the maternity care assistants. There are 4 of us altogether working on rotation. There's usually 2 of us here, but Bobby's assisting with the delivery. He's the only man on the team, so you can't miss him." Frankie gave Ella a wink. She appeared to be in her late 40s, and she was very pretty. It looked as if she'd gone up a couple of dress sizes since she'd been issued with her uniform, but she clearly wasn't giving in until the fabric did. "Great to meet you, Frankie. I always relied on the MCAs for everything in my last job, so I'll probably drive you mad asking questions." "Ask me anything you like. The only thing I won't reveal is my weight. That's between me, the scales, and my fat club leader, although she threatened to chuck me out if I don't start losing, or at least stop gaining." Frankie had the most infectious laugh, and Ella already felt better about taking the job. What she needed more than anything was to be surrounded by people who could make her smile. "I'm not sure if I can follow that, but I'm Jess." The blonde woman sitting opposite where Anna was standing stood up and shook Ella's hand. "Thanks to your arrival, I'm no longer the newbie here, although it hardly feels like that after the best part of a year anyway. But it's the sort of place that people don't want to leave, which means everyone's been here for ages. So watch out, just because you think you're only going to be here for 6 months, it doesn't mean it's true." "That's because you've got such an understanding boss, right?" Anna grinned. "Of course. Although the fact that one of the other midwives, Gwen, brings in cakes and biscuits she's baked for us almost every time she's on shift might have something to do with it." Jess had barely got the words out before Frankie cut in. "I made the mistake of mentioning that to my fat club leader, and she threatened to come in here and tell Gwen not to let me have any more of her bacon." Frankie wrinkled her nose. "She'll be putting posters of me up in the chip shop and Mehenick's bakery at this rate, with a note saying, 'If you see this woman, don't serve her.'" "My parents own Mehenick's bakery." "Oh, Ella, you lucky then, although God knows how you stay so slim." Frankie pulled another face. "If I had unlimited access to your dad's pasties and those split cream buns, I'd be the size of a house. Now you come to mention it, though, I can see the resemblance between you and your mum. You got the same blue eyes. She came to Fat Club for a bit. Not that she needed it, but there was a big family wedding or something, and she said she wanted to look good in the photos." Talk of the cake-making guru. Ella, this is Gwen." Anna swiftly changed the subject as a woman with grey hair pulled up into a neat bun came into the room. Anna was probably almost as grateful as Ella for the timely interruption. She was fully aware why Ella had been so willing to accept a demotion to return to Port Agnes for a temporary role, but she clearly hadn't shared it with the others, and Ella liked her new boss all the more for it. No doubt it wouldn't be long before Frankie put 2 and 2 together and worked out it was Ella's wedding her mother had been dieting for. Hopefully she'd be able to get through the first morning without having to talk about it, though. "Nice to meet you, Ella. Welcome to the team." As well as Gwen, the oldest of the midwives at the unit, Ella was introduced to Tony, another community midwife. There were 2 other MCAs who worked opposite shifts to Frankie and Bobby, who she didn't get to meet, 3 more midwives, currently on nights, and 1 who was on annual leave. It was quite a big team, but they covered the stretch of Cornwall from Port Agnes up as far as Port Cara, which was 20 miles north. The boundaries of the region they covered went about 5 miles inland too, all along that stretch of coast. Any patients unable to give birth in the unit could still have their antenatal care in the community, or at the unit, but they had to travel to the hospital in Truro for the delivery. "Right, I'll just get the morning briefing out of the way." Anna smiled at Ella. "Then Jess can take you out on the road. You probably know Port Agnes better than most of us, but there might be parts of the area we cover that you don't know so well. And Jess has got at least 1 appointment up at Port Cara, and you'll be taking over the care of a couple of the ladies you'll meet today." "I'm looking forward to working in the community." Ella felt her shoulders relax a bit. At least outside of Port Agnes, she might not have to worry every 5 minutes that the wedding that never was would get a mention at any moment. To anyone outside her hometown, her 15 minutes of fame were already very old news, and at worst, a discarded newspaper lining the bottom of a bird's cage. But in the town where she'd grown up, there were people who'd never forget what they'd read about her in the papers, and, worse still, those who wouldn't let her forget either. Whatever Jess might think, 6 months back in Port Agnes would be more than enough for Ella. Jess was one of those people who had no inhibitions about singing along at the top of her voice to whatever song the local radio DJ was playing. So what if she made up her own words to half of the lyrics? It certainly didn't bother her, and neither did the fact that she couldn't hold a note. Ella would have loved to have had that sort of confidence, but hiding in plain sight had always been more her style. Three Ports Radio, the station serving the coast from Port Agnes to Port Cara, seemed to be stuck in the 70s and 80s, if its preferred playlist was anything to go by. Although, according to Jess, there was a good reason for not changing stations. "I know he's got a bit of the Alan Partridge about him." Jess turned her head for a second and grinned at Ella before fixing her gaze firmly back on the road ahead. "But it's the only radio station where you're guaranteed to hear if Johnny Tengle's sheep have escaped onto Holly Bay Road before it's too late and you find yourself in a traffic jam that can only be shifted if you got the stamina to herd 30 clinically stupid ewes back into the safety of their field. Trust me, I've done it, and it's even harder than it sounds." "That was Donny Osmond with Puppy Love," the DJ shouted the announcement, so that it came out of the speakers about 3 times louder than the song that had just finished playing. "Talking of puppy love, did anyone read the article in this week's Three Ports News about local woman Kaylee Mackenzie from Port Cara, who's fallen in love with her goldfish? I don't know about puppy love. That sounds more like guppy love to me." "What better song could I play next than Kaylee by Marillion, whose lead singer is, you've guessed it, Fish?" "I think I might prefer to herd sheep than listen to this." Ella couldn't help smiling, though. At least she hadn't been in love with a goldfish. Just a bloke who turned out to have the memory of one when it came to remembering why he wanted to marry her. Poor old Kaylee Mackenzie was having her 15 minutes of notoriety on Three Ports Radio now, and making headlines in its sister paper. Although maybe Kaylee was one of those people who wanted fame at any cost, even if it meant getting engaged to a fish. "You'll get used to it. I expect this is all a bit of a culture shock, coming back here after spending so long in London. Did you never think about coming back before now?" Jess navigated a bend in the road as they began to climb upwards and inland towards their first home visit. A second-time mum-to-be called Lissy Holmes, whose care Ella would be taking on. The steep banks and stone walls cut off the view of the sea back in Port Agnes, and Ella shifted in her seat. "I stayed in London after I finished my degree, mainly because Mum and Dad had insisted on using up their savings to pay for my course, instead of just letting me take out a loan. I felt like I owed it to them to stay on up there and make the sort of career for myself that would repay their investment." Ella still wished she'd been able to persuade her parents not to spend all their money on her, but the impasse they'd found themselves at had led to one of the biggest rows they'd ever had. All her father had needed to mention was his blood pressure, and she'd had to agree to their plans. "And what about now?" "I met someone, but things didn't work out, and I realised there was some truth in what my dad had been saying for years. You can take the girl out of Cornwall, but you can't take Cornwall out of the girl. I just had this longing to come home and do some work in the community where I grew up, at least for a while. I was delivered by a local midwife in my parents' bedroom, so community midwifery was always close to my heart, even though I took a different route. Mum and Dad tried for a baby for a long time before me, and I was in a bit of distress after I was delivered. It's why my middle name is Abigail, after the midwife who delivered me, because Mum and Dad were so grateful to her, and they were convinced she was the only reason I survived. I grew up being told that midwives had the most important job in the world, and so it was all I ever wanted to be. But the midwifery unit wasn't even built when I first completed my training. I'm so sorry about what your parents went through." The look on Jess's face suggested she meant what she'd said. But I can't help agreeing with her.